Hello. We are recording the first module on language contact. There are three objectives to this module. First, to introduce the notion of language contact. Second, to introduce various approaches to classifying language contact situations. And third, to describe specific outcomes of language contact. Almost all languages in the world develop in contact with another language. In this sense, almost all of the world's languages can be said to be in contact situations. Language contact occurs when speakers of two or more languages live in close proximity of each other, or if a single speaker is bilingual or multilingual. This language contact can occur throughout a community and in a single speaker as well. This phenomenon of language contact is responsible for a large part of the vast diversity of languages found in the world. At times, language contact has dominated the entire development and history of particular languages. Some such languages are Korlai Marathi, which is spoken in the Konkan in Maharashtra and which developed through a fusion of Portuguese and Marathi. Yiddish, which is spoken in Central Europe and which has a Germanic base fused with elements from Hebrew, Aramaic, Slavic languages, and some Romance languages as well. Romani is a third example, which is spoken by the wandering gypsy population in Europe and which is a new Indo-Aryan language which is influenced by Greek, Persian, Kurdish, and Armenian. The practice of using two languages alternately is called bilingualism, and the person who uses languages alternately is a bilingual, as was defined by Weinreich in his seminal 1963 publication. Bilingualism can exist at the societal level, where speakers of two or more languages live together in close proximity. Bilingualism can also be at the individual level, where two or more languages coexist in a single person's usage. The bilingual's familiarity with more than one language leads to particular instances where the structure or functions, or both, of one language deviate from the norm for that language. Language contact can occur at language borders or as a result of migration, trade contact, colonization, military invasion, urbanization, etc. These cases of contact involve actual contact among speakers of more than one language. But contact situations may also arise where there is no real movement of people. For example, the Pali language spread out of India to countries such as Thailand, Burma, and the southeast with the spread of Buddhism. The language of television too can impact the viewer's language, though it does not involve direct contact among people. Contact linguistics is a field of inquiry interested in examining the linguistic outcomes and motivations for language contact. Whether in community bilingualism or in individual bilingualism, we observe a transfer of linguistic traits. Words, sounds, structures, and meanings can be transferred from one language to the other. Certain kinds of linguistic transfer are more likely than others. For example, even most casual contact with a second language can lead to the transfer of open-class words. Think of the abundance of such words which have entered the Indian languages from English. Also, certain kinds of linguistic transfer seem to occur in particular social circumstances, but not in a somewhat different contact situation. Besides the classification of language contact situations, some of the recurring themes in studies of language contact are the following. Identifying linguistic and social constraints on linguistic transfer in a contact situation. This theme had been preempted by Weinreich in the 1960s and remains relevant even today. Discussions of language contact are extended to dialect contact too. The difference is said to be one of degree rather than of kind. Yet another theme which is of interest to researchers in contact linguistics is the implications of language contact for language typology and for the genealogical classification of languages. We'll consider this theme in some detail when we discuss mixed languages in the next module. We will now proceed to look at the approaches to classifying the typical outcomes of language contact situations. Traditionally, a distinction is made between two main outcomes of language contact: borrowing and interference. The latter was a term introduced by Weinreich to refer to those aspects of a bilingual speech which deviate from the norm for that language and which occur as a result of familiarity with more than one language. Sarah Thomason makes a broad distinction between the processes of borrowing, where the lexical interference is strong, but the morphosyntactic and phonological interference is weak, and shift-induced interference, which is characterized by strong morphosyntactic and phonological interference, but weak lexical interference. This description does not exclude the possibility of describing the influence on one of the languages in a given contact situation as borrowing, and that on the other language as shift-induced interference. For example, Indian languages which reveal a large-scale incursion of lexical loans from English, and Indian English, which has significant morphosyntactic and phonological features from Indian languages. A third approach to classification comes from the work of Yaron Matras. He classifies the results of language contact using the terms matter replication, which involves grammatical or lexical borrowing. This is the replication of forms from the source language in the receiving language, and pattern replication, which involves contact-induced shift in meaning, distribution or organization of inherited material. Winford classifies the outcomes of language contact as follows. First, language maintenance situations where both or all languages in the contact situation continue to be spoken, and language shift where the more prestigious language begins to enter domains of use which were previously occupied by the less prestigious language. A third type is that of language creation, where the interacting groups in the contact situation create a new language to fulfill communicative needs. Arriving at a classification of contact outcomes is an important activity for contact linguists, but these attempts have been critiqued for not making a distinction between outcomes and processes of transfer of linguistic features. We will take up a discussion of processes of the outcomes of contact in the next module. We will now describe in some detail the outcomes of contact based on Winford's classification. Let us begin by looking at language maintenance situations. These situations lead to either borrowing or to convergence among the languages involved. Borrowing. When two languages come in contact with each other, the commonest type of linguistic transfer that takes place is the transfer of lexical items. By and large, vocabulary items from the more prestigious language in the contact situation tend to enter the less prestigious language. The terms superstrate and substrate are commonly used to refer to the more prestigious and the less prestigious languages, respectively. However, the notion of prestige itself can be questioned. Middle English, for instance, acquired a number of lexical borrowings from French during the Norman Conquest. French was considered prestigious by the English aristocrats, clergy, and other members of the highest economic class. French words entered Middle English in the domains of administration, church, military, science, food, fashion, etc. Such borrowed words or loans included the following: the words judge, chant, baron, jewel, majesty, gentle, rouge, chamber, etc. Arabic and Persian had a similar influence of the vocabularies of Indian languages during Mughal rule in the Middle Ages. Words such as dukan, aina, wazan, kacheri, faryad, daftar, etc., can be ascribed to this contact. A case where borrowings have taken place without actual contact between the speakers of the concerned languages is that of English loanwords in most modern Indian languages. Borrowings continue to take place long after the departure of the English-speaking colonial rulers from India. This is primarily because of the prestige ascribed to English in this country. These borrowings span over many domains beyond technology. Science, and learning. Address terms, for example, mummy, auntie, uncle, madam, sir. Household items, for example, fan, table, bed, plate. It will be a very long list. Can you think of more such domains in which we use English words? Of course, the speaker may not always be aware of the English origin of the words she uses. Let us now look at some of the motivations for lexical borrowings from one language into another. A gap in the recipient language could be such a motivation. For example, terms for new technology such as computer, tab, OTG, etc., or terms for a cultural borrowing, for example, pizza, nachos, bonsai, and so on. The motivation could also be the taboo surrounding the use of indigenous words in particular domains. For example, the toilet, delivery, as in childbirth, etc. Euphemistic use of words from another language is also observed. For example, death is a word which is transferred from English into Indian languages. Higher prestige ascribed to the other language, as in the case of English in India, could also be one such motivation. Taxonomies of borrowed items have been discussed by various scholars. Haugen, way back in 1950, proposed the following classification of borrowed items. He made a distinction between loan words, loan blends, loan translations or calques, and semantic borrowing. Let's look at each of these. Loan word is the term used when both form and meaning are borrowed into the receiving language from the source language. Loan blends when the word consists of a copied or a borrowed part and a native part. Loan translation or calque is the term used when a root-to-root or morpheme-to-morpheme translation of the borrowed word takes place. And semantic borrowing is the term used where only the meaning is copied from the source language into the receiving language. Now here's an activity that you can attempt. Can you identify the type of borrowed items in the following examples based on Haugen's classification that we just talked about? The examples are, first, the English word television borrowed into Hindi as Doordarshan. The second example is the English word computer borrowed into Hindi as computer. The third is the English word computer borrowed into Hindi as sanganak. And our last example is the English word cementing borrowed into Marathi as cementikaran. Of particular interest for the analysis of borrowing are the scales of borrowability proposed by various scholars. These hierarchies include both lexical and grammatical borrowing. Historical linguists noted the differential borrowability of core or basic vocabulary on the one hand and cultural vocabulary on the other. Core vocabulary refers to the most essential human activities, needs, etc. For example, words for eat, sleep, moon, rain, have, be, etc. would be a part of the core vocabulary. Cultural vocabulary includes names for new items of clothing, food items, etc. Examples would be pizza, lift, palazzo, etc. Of the two types, it is generally believed that core vocabulary offers greatest resistance to borrowing. It is expected that names for body parts, basic numerals, etc. are unlikely to be borrowed in language contact situations. But contact studies have revealed that if the contact situation has been of long duration and of the intense kind, core vocabulary can also be borrowed. Another attempt at establishing a scale of borrowability is the following. Content items borrowed more frequently than function words, borrowed more frequently than agglutinating affixes, borrowed more frequently than fusional affixes. In other words, lexical meanings are more likely to be borrowed than grammatical meanings. Nouns are more likely to be borrowed than verbs, and derivational morphology is more likely to be borrowed than inflectional morphology. Such scales can be interpreted in the following ways. First, a temporal interpretation. A language borrows elements on the left of the scale before it borrows elements further to the right on the scale. A second interpretation could be implicational. A language that contains borrowed elements on the right also contains elements further to the left. A third interpretation could be quantitative. A language borrows more elements belonging to the types on the left than elements belonging to types on the right. And a further interpretation could be probabilistic, that elements belonging to the types on the left are more likely to be borrowed than elements further to the right. The Loanword Typology project, headed by Haspel, Math and Tadmore at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, attempted to identify universals of lexical borrowing. The project built a database of 40 world languages and about 1,464 lexical meanings. The project finds the following borrowability scale: that nouns are borrowed more frequently than adjectives, borrowed more frequently than verbs, borrowed more frequently than adverbs. Among the least borrowable are demonstratives, personal pronouns, interrogatives, body parts, basic polysemous verbs. Let us now consider another outcome of language contact in a language maintenance situation: convergence. Long-term, deep-rooted contact among communities which live in close proximity and speak different languages often results in the languages in contact acquiring grammatical features from each other. Alternatively, all the contact languages in the contact situation may converge on a single shared grammatical structure. For example, languages belonging to all the 4 language families identified in the Indian subcontinent have shared linguistic structures. For example, they are all SOV languages, that is, the sequence of the main constituents of a sentence is subject, object, verb. We come across reduplicating strategies. We come across strategies for reduplication in all the languages. For example, in Hindi we have lal lal seb, red red apples, where the word red is repeated to suggest intensity of meaning. Echo forms, for example, in Hindi we have bagh vagh, in Tamil we have puligili, in Marathi we have bagh big, all meaning tiger and other similar animals. Such convergence in structural features leads to the formation of linguistic areas. We will explore convergence areas or linguistic areas in some detail in the next module. Both borrowing and convergence were outcomes of language contact seen in language maintenance situations. We will now consider cases where language contact results in one of the language groups losing its language. These are the language shift situations. Often minority languages, tribal languages, and such other less privileged languages give in to the social prestige of a super-straight language. The beginning of language shift becomes evident when the prestigious language is accepted first in public and/or formal domains of language use. For example, the language of schooling, political speeches, government communication, etc. The private domain, that is, interactions among various members of the family and the extended family, is usually the last bastion of a shifting language. Intergenerational transmission of language is thus important for the maintenance of a language. Once the prestigious language is established in the private domains as well, the less prestigious language dies. This phenomenon is referred to as language death. Let us now proceed to look at the third outcome of language contact, the creation of new languages. An extreme outcome of language contact is the creation of a new language for communication. Speakers of different languages often find themselves in a situation where there is a need to communicate but no shared language is available to fulfill this need. In such situations, a link language with extremely simplified grammar and a reduced lexicon, usually from the superstrate or the more prestigious language, is created to fulfill the need for communication. Such a language is called a pidgin. A classic contact situation which has led to the creation of pidgins includes the colonies established by European traders in the Atlantic, the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. This brought speakers of European languages in contact with non-European language speakers. Some of the pidgins which developed in these contact situations include Tokpisin and Bislama in Melanesia, Cameroon Pidgin English in Cameroon, Butler English in India, and Haitian French in the Caribbean Sea. The various varieties of Bazaar Hindi too are examples of pidgins. Pidgins are used by all speakers as a second language. It is nobody's first language. When the pidgins begin to be acquired by children as their first language, they develop into creoles, which have complex grammatical structure and are indistinguishable from non-creole languages in their grammatical and semantic capacities. Unlike pidgins, creoles are not restricted to particular domains of language use. For example, the Mauritian creole, which is a lingua franca in Mauritius today, developed out of a French-based pidgin which was used in the 18th century by slaves on the island. Bombay Hindi or Bombaya Hindi too has been described as a pidgin. We will consider some linguistic traits of pidgins, particularly Bombaya Hindi, in the next module. Finally, we take up the issue of constraints on contact-induced change. By and large, a change effected in any language is said to be caused by external contact rather than by internal factors if it was less likely to have occurred outside the contact situation. An ongoing debate in the field of contact linguistics is whether and to what extent language change resulting from contact is determined by linguistic and/or non-linguistic factors. Scholars such as Sarah Thomason are of the view that any linguistic change can be effected provided conducive social conditions obtain. Discussions on non-linguistic predictors of interference resulting from language contact have included social factors such as intensity of contact and duration of contact. Greater the duration and intensity of contact, greater will be the impact of the contact situation on the structures of the languages. Scholars have been able to match particular outcomes of contact with a particular social setting, resulting in a framework which has some predictive value. To summarize the module then, in this module we introduce the phenomenon of language contact, which is widespread in all parts of the world. Next, we noted some aspects of language contact situations which are studied by contact linguists. Finally, a classification of the typical outcomes of language contact and constraints on contact situations were discussed briefly. In the next module, we'll discuss in detail the processes of language contact. To summarize this module then, in this module we introduce the phenomenon of language contact, which is widespread in all parts of the world. Next, we noted some aspects of language contact situations which are studied by contact linguists. We looked at ways of classifying typical outcomes of language contact and briefly discussed constraints on contact situations.